Record. All right, so I'll start off with just obviously some of the basic details. Of course, this is all on LMS. I'm just pulling out some bits and pieces and talk you through each of the sections in terms of what we're looking for. So as you know, you're working in groups and you're preparing a needs assessment report based on the focus group recording that we provided. One of the things that I have done for you guys is I've also put up on LMS the list of questions that the students came up with as part of their interview schedule. I've also included some very minor details about the group. So for example, the number of participants, in case you hadn't already worked that out. And also if they've used a framework to develop the questions, I've included that. So that's all up on LMS in the assessment folder for you to access. So you'll have that information, which will come in handy when you start to think about the methods section. Okay. The word count for this assessment is about 600 words equivalent per student. Although I think that your reports will end up being quite long purely because of your interview transcript. So try to keep this around the 600 words per student for the main body of the report, so not including your appendices, okay? And try not to go over sort of 2,000 words maximum per group if you can. I think for me, I'm not so worried. So historically, Glenda and I have never really been worried about the word count. It's more about the quality of what you're producing. You know, this is a third year subject, it's capstone, and it's about preparing you for your field placements. So for us, it was more important that you get the skills and are able to articulate what you did and use theory to support what you did, rather than trying to adhere strictly to a word count. Okay, so if you go over, that's fine.
I just have a question, Karen.
Yeah.
It might be kind of a stupid question, but how do we add the transcript in as an appendix? Like, do we, like, because I feel like, is it, if we add it in, like, uncoded or whatever, like the original transcript, will it just be added on as like 20 pages or how are we supposed to do that?
I can show you, Adriana, unless no one else knows, but it's really quite simple.
Okay.
You would just literally add it after your references called Appendix 1 transcript, and you add a coded one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just copy and paste it into your report at the end of the report.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And because it's all in the same format, you don't even have to change the page layout or anything. Simple.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So Karen, to clarify,
yeah,
what you're really looking for is similar stuff to in the placement subject, where you want us to be able to express our ideas in as few words as possible.
Yeah.
As clearly and simply as possible.
Yep.
Supported with good quality theory.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So I want you to be clear and concise. And you'll see when I get into some of the sections that what we're asking for is for you to be brief. Like, it doesn't need to be pages and pages of writing. And I think you'll see that when you, don't touch this, when you see some of the student examples, you'll see that, you know, when I say brief, we mean brief, okay? It's about being very clear and very concise and using appropriate references throughout, all right? So yeah, so don't hesitate, don't worry too much about what the word count ends up being. And because once you start to add that transcript in, that your word count is going to be massive. All right. But focus more on, you know, from your introduction, your method, your result, and your conclusion, focus more on that in terms of the word count. All right. I'm in the middle of something, sweetheart. You're going to have to go, okay? Yes. My what, darling? I'm doing my work now. See? Okay. You're going to go for a bike ride. Okay. No, you can't do the buttons. Mum's in class. You need to go now. Sorry, everyone. This is my
All
life.
right.
All right, so let's get on to, so this is worth 40% of your overall marks for the subject. And of course, we'll go through, be submitted through LMS, and we'll go through Turnitin. I haven't opened up the submission link. I'll do that probably a bit later this week, so it's there in case you do want to start running some drafts through. And we'll come back and talk about that due date at the end. All right, so you should go and check the marking guide along with the assignment guidelines, along with this recording and what we're talking about today, and looking at the slides, and also have a look at the past student example so that you get a complete picture about what we're talking about here. But just to give you a run through on the format of the report, this should follow a conventional formal report style. So that is, you should have a cover page, and on your cover page, you'll of course have you'll have the title of your report, you'll have your names, your student IDs. If you wanted to, you can have things like logos. So for example, you know, if your group, the SES group, you might want to put the SES logo, you can put the Trove logo. So try and make it look like a professional report, okay? Then you'll have a table of contents. So your table of contents must include headings and any subheadings that you use, and of course the page numbers. I have put up on LMS a link to a video with instructions on how to automatically generate a table of contents in Word. So if you set up your headings in Word using the formatting function, you can then just automatically insert the table of contents, and you can just it'll automatically start to update the page numbers as you move things around. Saves you an awful lot of time, and also in terms of presentation, it just looks so much more professional, okay? There'll be an introduction, so this will talk about what a needs assessment is and why, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a moment about that. You'll have a methods section, so this will tell us what you did in detail and why you did it that way. There'll be a results section where you're telling us what you found from the focus group, and then there'll be a brief discussion and conclusion, and your appendices as well. And I'll talk you through in more detail about each of those. Just in terms of, yep, Adriana?
Sorry, just another question. So with the method, would the thematic analysis be included in the method, or would it be in the results?
It'll be in your method. I'll talk through that in a moment.
Okay.
Cool. Your format, so as I said, this should be presented as a formal report, and it should be written using obviously professional report writing style. And I'd be expecting you to be using at this point, you know, language that actually reflects you know, health promotion, and as well as needs assessments and program planning and evaluation. So I want you to be using the language that we've been exposing you to over the past sort of 2 and a bit years now, okay? And just to remember that you're writing for me, your examiner, you're not writing for the community. So just bear that in mind, that we're not writing this report to send out to the community, you're writing it for me. Okay, because if you're writing, yeah.
So Glenda and Nikki both were talking about that in the recording, actually.
Yep.
And I know we've had a few occasions to practice writing for community where we don't use jargon. But when we're writing for you,
yep,
to some extent, we need to demonstrate that we know the jargon.
Yes.
Would that be correct? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's why I want you to use that language that we've been exposing you to. Okay. Because again, this is also about, you know, preparing you for field placement and for you to demonstrate to us that you've developed those knowledge competencies. Okay. All right. So the introduction, your introduction is worth 10 marks overall. And I think it's pretty straightforward what we're asking you to do in this section. What you need to do is tell me what a needs assessment is and why they're necessary, and use some literature to support that. So, for example, you might, you know, define what a needs assessment is. You could link it to community development as an approach that's used in community development. You could link it to some theory around needs, for example. So, you know, we use needs assessments to look at things like felt needs. And you want to provide us with the rationale for why we would do a needs assessment. Okay, so you will need to use some literature here.
Karen, question about that.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. I know you miss me. I have had a look at some of the resources you've given us, and you're quite correct. A lot of them we are not going to be able to access, like Liam Patong. That's only hard copy.
Yeah.
But our textbook, which we can get as an ebook, is great. So could we just use the definition from the textbook?
Yeah, of course.
They cite someone called Smith from 2006, which is also hard copy. So we'd have to do it as a secondary reference.
As a secondary, yeah, that's right.
You know, in the circumstances, it can't be avoided. And then with regards to why they're necessary, do you want more? Do you want journal articles, or would...
No, it doesn't have to be necessarily be journal articles. You know, there is, you know, Talbot and Verinder write a bit about why they do needs assessment.
And if you say if we link in community development, that gives us a whole lot more.
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
And you will still find articles out there that will talk about that, and also have a look at some of the resources that we've already got up on LMS, and also have a look in the library referencing, like the library reading list as well. There might be some useful resources there. I don't think you're not going to need tons of resources. If you have a look at some of the student examples, you'll see that, you know, there's a couple of really good references that most of them have used. This is not an extensive, you know, assignment.
This is not a lit review.
Exactly.
This is just saying, here's the theory, here's this reliable place, we found the theory, here's us showing that we understand it. Yep,
that's right.
Okay.
And the stuff around community, like community development, that there's lots of resources that I've got up on LMS that you can tap into, and they'll talk about needs assessments and, you know, identifying needs. You can draw on that literature and also have a look at the reference lists of those, because then that'll direct you towards some other resources. Yeah, there's no set number, like minimum number of references that are required, and I think that, you know, we just have to be mindful that you're not going to have that same level of access that you otherwise would have. We just have to deal with that. Okay.
Just for the field, when we also will not have the same level of access.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're simulation here, simulated learning. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question. When you say what public health theory may apply, for someone that's not a public health background, could you explain that, please?
Yep. So what you could do is also bring in some of the theory that's been presented in the first couple of weeks. So, for example, you might want to talk about the Ottawa Charter. So you could link, you know, needs assessments to the Ottawa Charter, you know, as a framework for health promotion. Where do needs assessments sit within, you know, the action areas? Or you could look at something like the Precede Proceed model. So needs assessments form part of that, you know, social, I've got a mind blank, the social diagnosis stage, so stage 1 in that model. And so you could link what you've done for this assessment, the task, to that particular framework. You could also bring in some theory around program planning, the program planning cycle, and link, you know, this particular task to that cycle. I think we had one group who did link theirs to something like the health belief model one year. I mean, there's lots of theory that you could, you know, link this to. The other thing is the literature around needs. So things like, you know, felt needs, expressed needs, normative, comparative. You could link some of that. So there's lots of theory that you could link in here, Claudia. I think that just because you're not a public health major doesn't mean that there isn't theory you could draw on. There might be something else from some of the other subjects that you've done that you could see how that might relate to what we're doing in this subject and in this particular task, and you could link that as well. But typically I try and keep it simple and link it to either Ottawa Charter or Pre-Seed really. And you'll see that in those student examples.
Can I bounce off Claudia's question? Would we be somewhat guided, because our teams who've generously given us their transcripts developed their questions, ours certainly did, based on the World Health Organization definition of health, which flows quite nicely into Ottawa Charter.
Yep.
But then also, Claudia, you did parkrun, something like that, parkrun. So that, like you said, Karen, might link quite well into something like a health belief model.
Could potentially, yeah. As I said, I've provided you with the framework that the groups have used to develop their questions. So that in itself is a bit of a clue as to
what we could
link here.
Yeah.
So if they've used Pre-Seed, for example, as the framework to develop their questions, I'd expect to see you talking about Pre-Seed in your introduction and linking that. So then you get that really nice internal logic in your introduction around the Pre-Seed model. When you get into your methods, you're talking about, how that framework was used to develop the questions. And then potentially you could use that again to, frame up your results section, although not absolutely necessary. It just gives you that, internal consistency, and that theory is driven throughout the report.
And that would then also give us the framework for how we would do our analysis to some extent?
To some extent, yeah, that's right. Yep.
If we were doing deductive.
Yep. So there's lots of theory, and I use, Claudia, the term public health theory really broadly. Okay. So I just want theory.
I just wanted a little bit elaboration. That was great. Thank you.
Yep. The other thing you should include in your introduction is, the identification or a brief description of the health issue or issues that have been identified in the focus group. So a little bit of an introduction to the themes that are going to be discussed in the results section. So remember, this is an introduction, so it should give us sort of the background, sort of theoretical framework, and then an overview of what to expect in the report itself. Okay.
And assets as well.
Yep, and assets as well. Yep, absolutely. So you want to leave me with no doubt as to what this report is going to be about. All right. It should give me a really good overview of your report. And of course, it should be referenced. All right. Any other questions about intro? Okay, let's talk about the methods. So the methods section is also worth 10 marks. And there's a couple of, we've kind of given you a bit of a breakdown of some of the headings or subheadings that you might want to use in this particular section. So one is around the question development. So how were the questions actually developed? And you can include the interview schedule as an appendix. And as I said, I've uploaded that on LMS for you. But the other thing is that some of you would have already developed an interview schedule for the original face-to-face focus group that you were intending to do. And so I think in your methods, you're going to have potentially a combination of what you had planned to do, and then with the changes, moving to that online learning and not being able to conduct a face-to-face focus group, you'll then need to discuss what you then actually did as a result of that. So it'll be a combination of, here's what we intended to do, here's what we actually did. Okay, so for example, in the question development, you might talk about that, you developed an interview schedule based on the World Health Organization's definition of health, and you developed 5 key interview questions, see appendix and number that. However, with the government's restrictions on social distancing and the university stating that we're no longer allowed to do face-to-face focus groups, you were then provided with an audio recording from a previous focus group that was conducted by another group. That group developed 4 questions based on the Pre-Seed model, for example. Okay, so talk about, if you had already started something, talk about that, and then talk about what you then did and got. Okay, The same with your participants. So, you know, you might talk about that initially you were intending to run your focus group with, you know, a group of, give me one of your groups that you were thinking about. I can't remember now. I think it was a church group, for example. So people who were regular attendants as part of a church group. However, the audio recording that you were given was a focus group that was conducted with, you know, the Castlemaine Men's Shed, for example. This consisted of, you know, 4 men aged between whatever, and I've provided that detail online for you on LMS. So you would just talk about that. So again, it's that, here's what we intended, here's what we actually did. Okay.
Is that in the interest of transparency, Karen?
Well, it's, yes, and it's about, so when you're writing a methods section, you have to write what you did. And so if you intended on doing something and you had already developed an interview schedule and had lined up a focus group, then, and that changes, you need to document that.
I don't know how it is for anyone else. We had a focus group in mind, but we hadn't contacted them.
That's fine. You could still talk about that. This is what you had in mind. And
because,
then,
you know, we had our class and then we could have contacted, but literally that day.
That's right. Yeah, that's
possible.
right.
So,
yeah.
Okay, so you would say this was our intention. This is how far we got, and then it changed.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of ways you could present this. One is you could present this under each of the subheadings, or at the start of your methods, you could actually write a little brief paragraph around, here's what we intended to do. However, due to the circumstances with the global pandemic, the following details what we actually did as a result of this. And then just talk about the recording bit and your participants based on that recording in the actual method section under these headings. There's no right or wrong way to present this, but I think you just need to be very clear and transparent about what transpired. Okay. There's a little bit there, you'll need to talk a bit about the study design. So that is, how did you collect the data? Well, you guys didn't. But there was a focus group that was run by another group. And so you could talk about that. And you could talk about the materials that would have been required for that particular group. So for example, audio recording, you know, you could talk about that. In this bit here, you'll also need to talk about what is a focus group. So what is it and why was that the most appropriate method to use? And so you'll be able to go back to the class materials for week 3. So when we had that compulsory session, so I talked a lot about what focus groups are, you know, the advantages, the disadvantages. So you could draw on that and the literature that's on LMS to help you write that particular section. Then you'll have your data analysis. So in this section, you'll talk about obviously thematic analysis. So again, you'll talk about what is thematic analysis, how you did the analysis, and you'll talk about things like the coding, you know, transcribing it. You'll talk about doing the coding, you know, looking for themes. You'll talk about what the process, what steps you took. So again, you can refer back to the materials that I talked about. Was it last week we did the analysis? I think we did that last week, didn't we? So draw on last week's material around thematic analysis. Okay. And then finally in this section, you'll have just a little bit around the strengths and the limitations of this study design. Okay. So what were some of the, you know, the strengths to this, you know, and then what were some of the limitations? So for example, you know, one of the limitations will be that it's not representative of the broader community. It's just, you know, maybe 4 or 5 people. You know, we can't actually say that that's representative of all people who are part of that particular group or a particular community, for example.
So by study design, do you mean a needs assessment, or do you mean a focus group?
It could be either.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be either.
So a needs assessment conducted with a focus group of not very many people and just one focus group
is not really, you know, it's not a comprehensive needs assessment. Yeah. The other limitation is that it only captures the felt needs. It doesn't capture other types of needs. So, you know, there's lots of things that you could talk about. I mean, you don't have to have a great deal of, you know, in this section. We just want you to have demonstrated that you've thought about the strengths and those limitations with this.
Another limitation would be the inexperience of the facilitators, which would have been the case if we'd run it too.
Yeah.
You get different quality information.
Yeah.
And another possible one would be what Nikki was talking about, where there might be bias in the way we code it, again, probably due to inexperience.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that you were working off, you know, a recording that wasn't your own, that you hadn't conducted that focus group, and therefore, you know, you can't see, or you're having to interpret the things like the body language and the tone without having, you know, observed that or having any notes to support that. So there is potential bias there. Okay, so I think there's quite a lot that you can talk about in that section, but it doesn't need to be, you know, pages and pages. You know, we're talking probably a paragraph, really. All right. And a balance. I want to see a balance of both strengths and limitations. I don't want to see just one or the other. Okay. Any other questions about the methods? All right, so there's a little bit here about participants. So just to break this down a little bit more for you. So this section, you'll want to discuss who your participants were and their characteristics, but don't include names, obviously, because remember, we're de-identifying this. But you can provide some characteristics, and I've given you, based on last year's reports for those recordings, some of those characteristics. So for example, the number of participants, how many men, how many women, that sort of stuff I've provided in that information that I put up on LMS this morning.
So broad demographic, nothing that could identify them.
Nothing that can identify them.
So for example, in our transcript, they talk a lot about their careers.
Mm-hmm.
In Bendigo, that could be identifying.
Yeah, potentially.
So we would leave that out of the report. Would that be fair?
For the methods, I think what you'd want to talk about is that, you know, you conducted your focus group with, you know, 4 men from, you know, the Castlemaine Men's Shed. Their ages range from this to this. Okay.
And so would you, and you don't need to talk about anything else particularly, because if you don't actually have hard demographic information, you don't have it.
That's right. You can only report what you've got access to, what you know. Yeah, what is the truth. Yeah. And a little bit about, it's also useful to think about why this might be helpful. So thinking about from a process evaluation perspective, who was reached? You know, it's only a small number of participants. There's a whole lot of, you know, people in the community, or potentially even from the groups that we haven't been able to reach. So for example, at the SES, this is only, you know, a group of maybe 5 or 6 people from the SES, which is a much larger organisation, and therefore, you know, this is not representative of all volunteers or people who work for that particular organisation. So you might just want to make a comment around things like, you know, the representation and the reach. Okay.
Would that be a bit of a replication of the limitations though? And is that okay?
That's okay, yeah, because the participants will come before the strengths and limitations. So you'll talk about this and then you'll pull that out again in the limitations. Yeah. But what you'll do in the strengths and limitations is discuss why it's a limitation. Okay. All right, the analysis, so just some things to think about. You know, we know that data analysis is that process of systematically arranging and presenting information in order to search for the ideas. And so you will need to describe, as I said, that thematic analysis approach. So you will talk about transcribing and, you know, talk about why you did that. What were the benefits of transcribing? And use some references to support that. You could talk about the coding process. So remember last week I talked about, you know, open coding and axial coding. So you'd talk us through what you did in terms of the coding and again, provide some references to support that. And then talk about how you then looked for themes. And how did you come up with those themes? And again, provide some references for that. You could also talk about, for example, how many people in the group coded. You know, did you all code, or did just one or two of you? Did you do cross-matching? So did you code the transcript independently and then come back and compare your codes, and then come to some sort of agreement about what codes you would use before, you know, perhaps going through the process again and doing the recoding? So talk exactly, you know, take us through the steps that you actually used to do the analysis. Okay. You might talk about that you know, developed a concept map, for example, you know, to think about the themes or relationships between the themes. And you could include those as appendices in your report to demonstrate how your thinking evolved around these particular themes. And, you know, you could, what I've done in the past is I've actually demonstrated the evolution of the thinking. So early concept maps right through to the final, here's what my themes actually look like. This is what I've ended up with. And you can just include those as appendices as different versions, as long as they're labeled appropriately.
Question about that, because this is only the second time I've done this. And I know for some people it's the first.
Yep.
So the first time I did it, probably the bulk of my work, because it was a real low-level one, was in the coding, in getting really clear on what falls into what code. So there were about 3 iterations of coded transcript.
Yep.
But because, again, it was a short transcript and quite low level, developing themes from that was fairly simple. So my concept map didn't change that much, but the codes did.
Yep.
What do you suggest? I don't know how it's going to play out this time.
Yep. So what you could do is talk through that process of how you went through that coding process. And what you could actually do is, if you've got an early list, you know, versions of that list of codes, you could talk about that and reference those, like put them in as appendices.
So final coded transcript.
Yep.
Lists of early codes.
Yep.
Right. So just show you're working out like it's a math problem.
That's right. So the idea behind this is, if somebody was to read your needs assessment report and replicate what you did, there's one, that there's enough information there for them to be able to replicate it. But 2, that if they followed what you did, they'd get the same results. Okay, so that's always a good way to think about, have I got enough detail here for somebody to be able to replicate what I did? And if they replicated this, would they get the same results? Okay. And of course, as I said, through the analysis, you'll use some references to support what you did and why you did it. Okay, so you want to be thinking as you're writing the methods, you're writing a rationale. One is, what did I do and why did I do it? Okay,
how many
and provide
references?
the references. What was that?
How many references?
Oh, I don't know, a couple?
Like 2.
Probably. Depends on what you've got access to.
Systematic analysis, and this is how we develop the themes, and here are my references.
Yeah.
For example,
yeah. And you might find that in your methods you're using the same, like if it's a good, you know, qualitative research textbook, you might find that one reference is enough for the entire methods section. But there are, I guess, the stuff around focus groups that, you know, you've got a lot of literature already on LMS that you can use. I think you're not going to need tons of references.
And what you're saying is, for many reasons, we don't need to particularly use anything that you haven't already given us.
That's right. Yep. Okay, the results themselves, so when you're presenting these are worth 10 marks overall. Really what we want to see is, what did you find? That's what we want to see. So you should be, you know, writing this under the themes that you've identified, and you should be using quotes to validate your findings. You can also use things like tables or graphs or figures if that's appropriate. Typically we don't see that, but you might. It's up to you how you interpreted the results. you do want to highlight differences in opinions or findings amongst your sample population. So, you know, if you've got, you know, maybe 2 people saying that, you know, use the transport example that I used the other week, you know, if you've got 2 people saying that, you know, access to transport is a problem, but you've got 3 people saying that there's no issues, then you need to show that in your results section. All right. So you want to show where there are differences of opinions. If everybody's in agreement, then say that. You want to make that really clear that, you know, there was unanimous agreement amongst the group that access to public transport is an issue, and then you'd use some quotes to illustrate that. Okay. It's just a tip on some of the words to use. The language that we use when presenting qualitative results is, you know, things like some, so some participants, or others. So, you know, some participants said this, however, other participants thought this. Sometimes you could use the language like one participant said this, whereas, you know, 2 participants felt the opposite. You can use that. The language that we don't use is, for example, majority, because it's very quantitative. And, you know, there's obviously rules around what a majority is. It's, you know, more than half. And you may not necessarily know that from your focus group. So we try to avoid those more quantitative terms and use things like some participants, most participants, all participants, none of the participants. Use that sort of language. When you're writing when you're trying to structure the results, you know, I would start off by stating what the theme is. So use the heading for the theme, and then give us a bit of an intro, you know, to that theme. What is the theme? Describe the range of responses, and then use a couple of direct quotes to illustrate the point that you're making. You don't need to use lots of quotes. 1 or 2 per theme or per point that you're making would be more than enough. But just remember, the quotes validate your findings. Okay, that's your evidence. And then you'd want to provide a little bit of an interpretive discussion paragraph at the end of the theme. So the so what factor, what have we learnt from this particular theme? What's the take-home message? And provide an overall summary identifying what those main themes were. So that would come at the end of the results section. So just reiterate or summarize the key themes.
Can you give us an example of the so what?
Oh, well, it might be, for example, you know, that you've identified the so what might be that, you know, access to public transport is an issue in this particular community. That's the so what. The barriers include things like, you know, cost, you know, the timetable, and there might be one other thing. That's the so what. And that this has implications for if there might be a relationship between that theme and something else. And so, for example, the so what factor might be that, you know, the lack of access to public transport is an issue, was identified as an issue by participants to accessing, you know, good quality healthcare.
So, for example, I haven't finished coding, but there is this really strong theme coming up around skills.
Mm-hmm.
And there is one theme of, in our group, people recognizing one another's skills,
Mm-hmm.
and another theme of society at large not recognizing their skills. So there's quite a nice so what situation there, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And then at the end of your results section, as I said, just do a little bit of a summary, an overall summary of the themes that have emerged in this section, and just reiterate what those are. Okay, it's just a nice little way to wrap up that particular section.
It's kind of a roadmap. You do it in the intro and then you do it at the end of each section kind of thing.
That's right. It's that signposting. At the start, you want to tell your readers what the themes were, and then at the end, you want to signpost again and just reinforce what those themes were. If you follow that for each section, that gives you a really lovely sort of structure to the report. This is an example of a mind map, and so you could include something like that as an appendix. Okay, so you know you can present some of your results visually. It doesn't always just have to be words. As I said, you could use tables or graphs if if that works, whatever works for you. As long as if you're going to include something like this as an appendix, then obviously it needs to be referred to in the body of the report. Okay. And then labelled correctly. All right, the conclusion. So this is only worth 5 marks and it needs to just be brief. Okay, so you really just want to, I mean, you're probably talking really about a paragraph here. Okay, so keep it brief. What do the results tell you? What can we imply from them? And perhaps what are some of the gaps and how can they be filled? All right, and you want to think about some recommendations. And so when you're thinking about the recommendations for this, think about your upcoming assessments. So think about your literature reviews. So for example, if we've identified that, you know, the results in this needs assessment show that access to public transport in rural areas, you know, is a bit of a concern, and that there are a number of barriers, the recommendation might be to go and look at the literature around public transport in rural and remote areas in Australia. And that would be the recommendation. The other thing you could think about is, you know, potential programs. You know, what are the recommendations in terms of, from a community development perspective, around what potential programs might look like. Okay, so keep it brief.
Question.
Yeah.
Would it be worth doing a super quick whip round so that there's actually, it seems a bit strange to make a recommendation without having seen what's out there. So I'm asking, should we have a quick whip round, or are we just like, felt need is this?
Yep.
They suggested because they might have some kind of solution, or they might have signposted a solution.
Yeah. Yeah. If they've signposted a solution, then you could, you know, use that as one of the recommendations. As, you know, as mentioned by one of the participants, a recommendation might be, and whatever that is.
Because, for example, where our group seemed really resistant to having some kind of structured activity imposed on them. And so they've signposted for you. Don't give me some structured activity because I'm not into that.
Yep.
So
what was the topic? What were they talking about?
The dinner group.
Yeah. What were they talking about in terms of?
It actually came up over and over and over again, like throughout the interview. It was fascinating in various ways. But the basic idea was they liked their group because it was so casual. And it actually made me think of Men Shed a lot.
Yeah.
And Kate, again, just coming back to that conversation we had last year, and it's sort of this really casual way to get together where there's not really an agenda, no one's ringing a bell telling you when things start. And some of it seemed to be that they'd all had these very structured careers and grown up in very structured times. And so what they wanted was just this really almost amorphous experience. The only thing that was set was where they showed up. And they kept saying that over and over again in various ways. It was really interesting.
And so then the recommendation might be, Nadine, about looking at the literature around, you know, the health promotion programs for older men, for example.
That's kind of where I was going.
Yeah.
Because I sort of thought, well, there's probably something here. I mean, it might be why something like Men Shed works, because it's just a space for people to gather. There isn't actually any structure, and there's probably a reason these things work.
Yeah. And so I'd be probably more inclined to make recommendations about the literature that you need to go and look at, because this will then set you up with ideas for assessment 2, which is your literature review.
So we don't actually have to start saying, what about this program? We could just say, there seems to be something here.
Yeah, there's a gap here, or there's a need, or there's an asset that we need to investigate. So it might be that there's something, you know, an asset that is emerging from this focus group that seems to be a real strength in this community. And you might make the recommendation to go and have a little look at the literature around that particular asset. So I'd probably keep your recommendations to the literature reviews. I think that will be a little bit easier to be thinking about at this stage, and because remembering that assessment 3, that program, is going to evolve from the combination of your needs assessment and the literature reviews. And each person in your group should be taking a different focus when it comes to that literature review. So one of you, for example, might look at a health issue. One of you might look at programs, one of you might look at policy context, for example. So you'll each take a slightly different look at the literature. And so if you can think about that now, you can make some recommendations in this report around that, and that'll set you up beautifully for that next assessment. But yeah, have a think about what are the gaps or what are the assets or the needs within this community and what can you recommend. All right, any other questions? Okay, so don't forget appendices. Now, in the assessment, we ask you to include consent forms, the recording. You won't be providing those, so please disregard that. You will need to provide your transcript, preferably coded, will be good. So that way I can see that you've gone through that particular process of coding and how you did that. And you can just copy and paste that into your Word document with your report. The interview schedule, so you could submit, if you'd originally developed one, you could submit that as an appendix along with the interview schedule from the group who conducted the focus group. The other thing that I'd ask you to include is a thank you letter. So just an example of a thank you that could be sent to the focus group had you actually done the focus group. And then think about anything else that you might need to include. So for example, any mind maps or concept maps, you can include those as well. Okay. Anything else you can think of? No. I think that's all I could sort of come up with. If you think of anything else, just include it. Just to, the full marking guide is on LMS, but basically it covers what I've just talked about essentially. It's a fairly basic marking guide, and we've kept it like that for a reason, is because you're all doing something different. You'll all have you know, sections that, you know, some of them will be longer than others. But I think as long as you're hitting those basic requirements, that's essentially what we're looking for. In terms of overall presentation, so there are 5 marks. And so those 5 marks include obviously things like the, you know, the report style. So both the presentation and the written expression. So, you know, grammatically correct sentences and paragraphs, etc. It does also include your referencing. So there aren't separate marks for the referencing, okay? But we still...
And finally...
Yeah. Well, you know, by third year, you should know how to reference. You should know. You do need to follow, obviously, APA 6 style, and that should include in-text and your reference list. I would ask you to use size 12 font and 1.5 line spacing. That just makes it much easier for reading on the screen when it comes to marking, including page numbers, and then just making sure that you format any headings and subheadings appropriately so that we can see the different levels. So for example, you can see that you've got your main heading, and then we can see a subheading that, you know, has a different font or a different size, indented, etc. And there are some really good guidelines. Even if you just Google report style, and APA even has suggestions on how to format reports. Not that you have to follow those strictly, but just make sure that it makes sense. I can see the main headings, I can see the subheadings. Yeah, that's really what I'm looking for. Okay, so these are a couple of examples. And I've popped these up on LMS, so these are already up there on a little separate PowerPoint. But I just thought it would be useful just to show you some of what we're looking for. As I said, these are not necessarily perfect examples, but they do demonstrate the different ways that you can address each of the sections that I've talked about. So this one here is an example of an introduction. And so you can see that, you know, they've got a heading, the main heading, introduction. There's a subheading, what is a needs assessment? And they talk a little bit about what a needs assessment is. They talk about one way to perform a needs assessment. And they talk about why we actually do a needs assessment. And you can see that that's all referenced. Okay. they've included a subheading on, public health theory. You could use that as a heading, or you could talk, use the heading that actually represents the framework or the theory that you're talking about. So for example, Ottawa Charter could be a heading, or proceed. And you can see that they've linked here needs assessment to that Ottawa Charter, and they talk about the particular action areas that it relates to. Okay, and this is the one that also talked about that health belief model as well. Okay, and then they've talked a little bit about some of the results, the themes that emerged from their focus group. Okay, and they've given a little bit of a background, some context or background information to support what they're saying here in terms of some references to Beyond Blue, because they were talking a lot about mental health. Okay.
Question.
So, yeah.
Would we need, because we're doing a needs and assets assessment, would we need to make sure we've covered that off in our definition?
Yeah.
That might be a little different to what this team did.
Yeah.
But I know that you're requiring us to do needs and assets.
Well, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be both. So it depends really on the questions that you've asked, whether your questions have been more about, needs or deficits, or whether they've been more about the strengths, or a combination. Up to you,
Right.
Nadine.
Okay, thanks.
This is another example of an introduction. So you can see they've got, the purpose of a needs assessment. So they outline what it is and why it's useful, and they've linked it to focus groups. And then they've also talked a little bit about precede and proceed, and that's the model that's been used for their report. So again, you can see you get that internal consistency. They've got it here. They will have used it in them, talked about this in their methods, and probably also used it in their results section as well. And then they've got a little bit around the themes, an introduction to the themes that emerged from their focus group. Okay.
Another question.
Yeah.
I've never seen an introduction with subheadings before. Is that an okay thing to do?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of an introduction / background.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not an introduction as you would expect to see in an essay, for example.
Yeah.
It is more of an introduction, bit of background material.
So we could name it background.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then do subheadings,
Yep.
one of which might be introduction.
Yep.
That makes more sense for my logic flow.
Whatever makes sense. As long as you're ticking off what we're asking you to do in the marking guide for that section. Yeah. This bit here follows on from that other one. So this is their framework. So again, they're talking about precede. So they talk about what it is, and they talk about how their focus group and the needs assessment fits within that particular framework. So you can see it's not very long. It's, we're talking literally, a paragraph. Okay. You don't have to write a whole assignment on the framework. Okay. This is an example of a method section. So they started off with the study design in this one. Okay, so they talk about qualitative data. So remember, we are using a qualitative approach. So you could talk about that in your study design. And then they talk a little bit about focus groups. They talk about, sorry,
Karen. Does it matter if you start it with participants or study design? Like, is it a set kind of way you do?
No, it's not really. I kind of like the study design first, because that gives the broader context for what you're doing, and then you can break it down into things like participants, questions, data collection, data analysis. To me, that makes more sense. But some students have done it in different ways, and that's fine. It's as long as you're hitting off that criteria. Okay. You can see they've got a bit there about their questions and how they developed those. They've linked it to the Ottawa Charter and the precede-proceed model. Included that as an appendix, the interview schedule. Okay. And then participants. So they've talked a little bit about the ethical requirements of participants. So all of the participants had to be over the age of 18 and had to meet for reasons other than for health issues. And then they describe who their participants were. So again, you can see really basic characteristics here and why they were selected. So this is about that reach, that, you know, that representativeness of that group. Okay, so brief. There's a little bit there about the materials they use. So they talk about recording it, that they provided a copy of the questions for the moderator and the scribes. You're not going to be able to talk about that because you're not going to know that. But what you will know is that they were audio recorded, and that you could also talk about consent and the participant information sheet, because they had to go through that process as well. So you can talk about that.
So materials really are the materials used to gather the data.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And then they talked about actually conducting the focus group, which you're not going to be able to really talk about, but what you can talk about is how you were given the recording. You could talk about how long that went for, etc. Okay. Then there's data analysis. So you can see again, you know, a paragraph on data analysis. So they talk about that after the completion, you know, it was transcribed and coded. They did a thematic analysis and they talk about what that is. And then they talk about how each student coded their section. So they broke it down into sections and shared their common themes with the group. And then they talked about the themes that emerged and how subcategories were sorted under those themes. And then a little bit on the strengths and the limitations.
And I see they've used Brown and Clark. That's great. That's kind of a gold standard, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But there's lots of, I mean, you know, when it comes to thematic analysis, there's lots of resources that you can use.
It's just because I already have Brown and Clark, and I'm like, great, one thing I don't have to do.
Good, and use it. There are other resources on LMS that you can use. This is an example of the results. Now, this is not a full results section. This is just a bit that we've taken out of one. So you can see that they talk about, introduce the theme, and then you can see that they've used the participant quotes. And when you're presenting participant quotes, you should always use quotation marks. And really you should use italics as well. So that just distinguishes your voice from the participants' voices. Okay. And then
question.
Yeah.
About that.
Sure.
I remember seeing an example last year where they'd actually used pull quote boxes for the, is that an okay thing to do? Because it just flags it.
Yep. Yep. So what you can do is for each theme, you can include this as appendix, is do up a table where in one column you have the theme, and in the other column you can have all of the quotes that fit under that theme, and you can refer to that as an appendix, put it in the appendix. And so that, and then you could use like one or two of those in the actual results section when you're writing it up, but refer to appendix whatever for further examples.
And is that kind of useful because that shows the strength of your evidence?
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And it's a great way to show that strength without blowing out your word count.
Yep.
Yep. But you don't have to do that. And then just a quick example of the conclusion. So you can see brief, like really brief. And you can see that they've made some recommendations for some further research. So in this case, the further research is regarding gardening and its implications on health in different age groups. So that's obviously the direction they'd be going in with their literature reviews. Okay.
Oh, that's nice. So super brief, not complicated.
Yeah.
Just the one recommendation, because that's what we're going to be doing next. So.
Yep. Good. You might have some further recommendations if you've got a couple of key themes. But if you've got one major theme or one topic that consistently comes up, make the recommendation around that. There's no rules about how many recommendations. Yeah, at least one.
It looks like, I mean, we will have multiple themes, but it goes to social well-being more than anything else.
Yep.
It just happens that that's how it turned out for our group. I don't know how it is for everyone else's. So that might be, it's just the strongest theme.
Yep. And so that might be you make a recommendation because that is the strongest theme. Yep. Good. All right.